The morning room at Harrogate House smelled of beeswax and cold tea, and into that hush walked a young man in a coat that cost more than a year of her labor, holding a torn sleeve out from his body as though it might bite him. Eleanor Mercer did not rise. She had learned in 3 years of trade that rising too quickly told the customer they had power over you, and the young man before her had been told he had power over everyone since the day of his birth. He let the sleeve drop onto her cutting table, among the pins. He looked at her plain gray gown, at the chalk on her knuckles, at the small spectacles she pushed up her nose, and he smiled the way men smile at a thing they have decided is beneath them. "My father said the village had a woman who could mend a seam," he said. "I confess I expected someone less of a mouse, perhaps. You will have this ready by Thursday, and you will not speak of the tear, because the tear is not the sort of thing a gentleman discusses with a tradeswoman." She took the sleeve. "The wound in the wool ran from cuff to elbow, ragged. The kind a fence does not make and a fist sometimes does." She said nothing of that. She said only that Thursday was possible. And she named her price, and she watched his face decide that her price was insolence. What he did not know, what the room did not know, what even she did not yet permit herself to know, was that a woman who has lost everything learns to read a man's whole history the way he hands her a torn thing. If you have ever been looked at the way Eleanor was looked at that morning, stay with me. You will want to see how this ends. She was 24 years old, and she had not always sat at a cutting table. The Mercers had held a small manor in the next county until her father's death, 2 winters past, handed his debts to a cousin who had no use for daughters. There had been a house with a yellow morning room. There had been a mother at a pianoforte. There had been a future that did not require Eleanor to count pins. The cousin had sold what could be sold and turned the rest over to creditors, and Eleanor had taken the one thing the law could not strip from a gentlewoman fallen out of her station, which was the skill her mother had taught her at the same pianoforte, the skill of the needle, fine work, invisible mending, the seams that do not show. She had come to the village near the great estate because great estates need clothes mended, and ask few questions of the hands that mend them. She had told no one. Her father had been a gentleman. To the village she was Miss Mercer, the seamstress, and the village had decided what that meant. The young man who had dropped the sleeve on her table was Julian, son and heir to the Duke of Harrogate, and the village spoke his name the way it spoke of weather, as a thing that arrived and could not be argued with. He was 19, golden, careless, and the torn sleeve was not the first secret the great house had sent down the hill to her needle. She had mended a waistcoat with powder burns once. She had taken brandy stains out of a cravat that smelled of a tavern no duke's son should know. She kept her counsel and her stitches small, and she told herself this was simply the work. It was the second visitor that week who changed the shape of everything. He came on the Wednesday, in the rain, and he did not drop anything on her table. He stood in her doorway and took off his hat, which no man of the great house had ever done in her shop. And the gray afternoon light fell on a face she would later try and fail to forget. Adrian Thorne, Duke of Harrogate, was not what the village said dukes were. He was 34, dark, with a jaw set like something carved against weather and eyes the color of smoke over a winter river, and he stood in her doorway, dripping, and looked at her cutting table, as if it were the only honest object he had seen all day. "You mended my son's coat," he said. His voice was low and level, a voice that did not need to be loud, because it had never once in its life been ignored. "I have come to pay for it." He did not pay you. She had not expected to be paid. She had expected, when she allowed herself to expect anything, to be forgotten. She named the price again, smaller than she should have, and he set the coins on the table and did not move toward the door. He was looking at the sleeve which lay finished now across the back of her chair, the ragged wound in the wool gone as though it had never been. "Where is the tear?" he said. It was not quite a question. "There is no tear, your grace." she said. "That is the whole of the work." Something moved in his face then, the smallest thing gone, before she could name it. He had come down the hill expecting to find a woman who had seen a torn sleeve and gossiped, and he had found instead a woman who had made the evidence vanish and would say nothing of it. And the difference between those two women was the difference between his family's ruin and its peace. He did not thank her. Men like the Duke were not built to thank. He set his hat back on his head and stood a moment longer than the transaction required, and the air in the small shop changed in a way Eleanor felt at the back of her neck before her mind would consent to notice it. "You will mend whatever this house sends you," he said, "and you will send your accounting to me directly, not to my steward, to me." Then he was gone into the rain, and Eleanor stood with the coins in her palm and a sleeve across her chair, and the unfamiliar sensation of having been seen. She did not trust it. A woman who has been told by lawyers and cousins and the entire machinery of her father's debts that she is a problem to be solved does not learn to trust the feeling of being seen. She put the coins in the box. She told herself the Duke had come about a sleeve, and nothing more. The village, however, had begun to talk, and the village's talk had a shape. She had refused an invitation from the curate's wife to take tea, because tea required time she did not have, and a gown she no longer owned. And the refusal had been read as pride. A seamstress with pride was a thing the village found delicious. At the market that Saturday, Mrs. Harris Pellance, who kept the linen drapers and considered herself the arbiter of who in the village was respectable, said it plainly to a circle of women who made sure. Eleanor heard. "She gives herself airs, that one. A girl who sews for her bread, looking down her little spectacles at honest folk, mark me. She fancies herself above us, and there is nothing the great house likes less than a tradeswoman who forgets her place." Eleanor counted her change and did not look up, and the chalk dust feeling crept up her throat. The old familiar shame of having once had more and now having less, and being despised for the memory of it. What none of them knew was that the great house had not forgotten her at all. The accountings went up the hill, and came back paid, and twice more that month torn things arrived, and twice more she mended them invisibly, and held her tongue. She began to understand that the things she mended told a story she was not meant to read. A shirt with a torn collar, a coat with a button torn clean off, and the wool gone with it. Once, a lady's glove that had no business being among a gentleman's mending, fine kidskin, a tear at the seam, and a faint scent she did not recognize. She mended it all. She read it all and said nothing. And the Duke's instruction held. The accountings went to him directly, and twice, when she carried them up herself, because the boy who ran errands was ill, she found him in the library, and twice he did not send her away. The library at Harrogate was a room 3 stories of books, high, candle-lit even in the afternoon, because the windows were narrow and the shelves drank the light, and the first time she carried her accounting into that room, she understood she was somewhere she had not been permitted to stand since her father's house was sold. The Duke was at a long table with papers spread before him. He did not look up at once. When he did, he looked at her the way he had looked at the cutting table, as though she were the one honest object in a room full of obligations. "You read them," he said. "The things you mend, you know what they are." She might have lied. A wiser woman, a woman with more to lose, would have lied. "I know that your son tears his coats in ways that coats do not tear by accident," she said, "and I know that you would rather the village did not count the tears." "I do not count them, your grace. I mend them, that is all." He was quiet for a long moment. The candles moved. Then he said, not as a question, "Who taught you to mend like that? That is not a village hand." And Eleanor, who had told no one in 3 years, found that she could not lie to this man in this room. "My mother," she said, "at a pianoforte that is no longer ours." He did not ask what she meant. He understood it whole the way he had understood the absent tear, and the understanding sat between them in the candlelight, and neither of them touched it. She set the accounting on the table. He told her to sit, which was not an invitation but a command. And she sat, and he poured her a glass of wine she did not drink. And for the space of half an hour the Duke of Harrowgate spoke to a seamstress as though her opinion of the management of a great estate were a thing worth having. She did not understand it. She did not let herself understand it. Yet, when she walked back down the hill in the dark, her hand kept finding the place on her sleeve where his glance had rested as though he had touched her there, which he had not. It was the boy who showed her the truth of the great house, and the boy was the reason the Duke had stopped looking like stone. His name was Thomas, and he was 6 years old, and he was the Duke's ward, the son of a brother lost in the war, and he did not speak. He had not spoken, the kitchen women said, since the news of his father came, 2 years past. He drifted through the great house like a small ghost, and the staff had given up on him, and his cousin Julian mocked him openly, calling him the dummy, the half-wit, the family's little disappointment, in front of guests and servants alike. Eleanor met Thomas the third time she came up the hill, when she found him sitting in the corridor outside the library with a torn shirt in his lap, picking at the threads, his small face fierce with the effort of mending what he did not know how to mend. She sat down on the cold floor beside him, without a word. She took the shirt. With her, she showed him how the needle went, slow, patient, her chalk-rough hands guiding his small ones, and she told him a story while they worked. A quiet story about a tailor who could sew anything, even a hole in the sky, even a tear in the morning. Thomas did not speak. Still he leaned against her arm, and he watched her hands, and when the small, clumsy seam was done, he looked up at her with something in his face that had not been there before. She did not know that the Duke stood in the library doorway and saw all of it. She did not know that he had been standing there long enough to hear the whole of the story about the tailor. She only knew that when she rose to go, the Duke was at the end of the corridor, and his face had changed, and he said nothing at all, and his silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. That was the moment, though. Neither of them would have named it so. A man who has watched a child be called a half-wit for 2 years, and watched the world agree and been unable to reach the boy himself, does not forget the woman who sits on a cold floor, and teaches that child to mend a shirt, and tells him he could sew a hole in the sky. The Duke's wound was the boy. The Duke's wand was the brother he had failed to bring home, and the silent child that failure had left him. And he had wrapped himself in stone because stone does not have to feel the boy's silence every morning at the breakfast table. Eleanor had reached the boy in an afternoon. The Duke did not know whether to be grateful or undone, and a man like that, faced with a thing he cannot manage, grows colder before he grows warm. He grew colder. For a fortnight the accountings went up and came back. Paid, and he did not send for her, and did not appear when she came. She told herself this was correct. She told herself the half hour in the library had been a lapse on both their parts, a Duke condescending and a seamstress forgetting herself, and that the proper order of things had reasserted itself, as it always did, as her father's creditors had taught her it always would. She mended what came down the hill. She endured the village, and she did not admit, even lying awake in her cold small room above the shop, that she listened for the sound of a particular horse on the lane. The proximity, when it returned through Thomas. The boy began to come down the hill. He came with a footman the first time, carrying a torn thing that did not need mending, a handkerchief with a hem barely loose, and he sat on her floor and watched her work and leaned against her arm, and she understood that the torn handkerchief was an excuse, and that someone in the great house had permitted the excuse. The someone was the Duke. He came himself the third time the boy came, on foot, in the early dark, and he stood in her doorway again with his hat in his hands, and he watched his ward lean against the seamstress as if leaning were a thing the boy had been born knowing how to do. "He sleeps now," the Duke said, "since you taught him the needle. The nurse says he keeps a threaded needle under his pillow. I do not pretend to understand it." He paused. The candle on her table guttered and steadied. I find that I do not need to understand it. I find that I am grateful. That is not a sentence I have had occasion to say." Eleanor's hands went still over the work. The room was very small, and the Duke was very near, and the boy was warm against her side. And she was aware of exactly where the Duke stood without looking at him, aware of the breadth of him in her doorway, aware of the cold air at his back and the warm air at the fire, and herself between them. Her pulse moved in her throat. She said, because she did not trust the silence, "He is a clever child, Your Grace. The world has only been unkind to him." "The world has been unkind to a great many people," the Duke said. He was looking at her hands. "Eat something. You have grown thinner since the spring." It was not tenderness. It had the shape of a command. Underneath the command, though, was a thing Eleanor had not been offered in 3 years, which was a person noticing whether she ate, and the command landed in her chest with a force the tenderness could not have managed. She did not answer. She bent her head to the work so he would not see her face. He stayed until the boy grew sleepy, and then he gathered the child against his shoulder. This stone man holding a small sleeping ghost as though the ghost were the most fragile thing in England, and he carried him up the hill in the dark. And Eleanor stood in her doorway and watched them go and pressed her hand flat against her own breastbone, as if to hold something in. If your own chest has ever ached at a small mercy from someone the world told you was above you, you understand her now. I will not keep you long from what comes next. What came next was Julian, and the diamonds, and the dinner. The Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, had come from London for the autumn, and the Dowager had a plan, and the plan had a name, and the name was Lady Cassandra Vane. The Dowager was a woman of 70, who wore her late husband's authority like a second set of jewels, and she had decided that Julian, wild and golden and untethered, would be steadied by an early and advantageous match, and that the Duke himself, a widower these 6 years, and far too long unwed, ought to be steadying himself with the same medicine. Lady Cassandra was 23, polished to a high, cold shine, with a fortune and a pedigree, and a way of entering a room that informed the room it had been waiting for her. The Dowager had arranged everything. She had not arranged for a seamstress. Eleanor learned of the dinner because she was summoned to it, in a manner of speaking. A gown of Lady Cassandra's had suffered in transit from London, a flounce torn, a delicate thing, and nothing in the village would do but the woman who mended invisibly, and so Eleanor was brought up the hill on the afternoon of the dinner, to repair the gown in a servant's passage, while the great house bloomed with candles overhead. She mended the flounce, and as she knelt, with the pins in her mouth, Lady Cassandra stood above her in her shift, and addressed the Dowager, who sat in a chair watching the work, with the contentment of a general whose troops are in position. "They tell me she had a manor once," Lady Cassandra said, looking down at Eleanor as one looks at a stain on a floor. "A gentleman's daughter, sunk to this. I find it rather pitiable. A woman ought to keep to the station God assigns her, and when she cannot, she ought at least to have the grace to disappear. This one persists. She comes up the hill. She is spoken of, her painted mouth curved. She is, in short, a seamstress who has forgotten she is a seamstress." The Dowager laughed. A dry, small sound. "Quite. The Duke indulges the boy's fondness for her, which I shall correct. The lower orders mistake indulgence for affection. It is a kindness, really, to remind them what they are." She did not lower her voice for Eleanor's benefit. She raised it. "You there. When you have finished, you will use the back stair, and you will not be seen in the front of this house again. My son's household has had quite enough of the village's imagination." Eleanor finished the flounce. Her hands did not shake because 3 years of creditors had taught her hands not to shake, but something behind her ribs had gone cold and small and very still. She rose. She gathered her pins. And she had reached the door of the passage when the Duke appeared in it, dressed for his own dinner, and stopped, and took in the scene whole, the seamstress on her feet with her box of pins, the rival in her shift, his mother enthroned, the freshly mended flounce, and the particular quality of the silence that follows cruelty. "Mother," he said. His voice was very level. "Miss Mercer is not to use the back stair. Miss Mercer is to be paid, thanked, and shown to the front door by the butler, as any person who does this house's service is shown." He looked at Eleanor, and for one moment the stone was gone entirely from his face. "Forgive my mother's notions of station. They are older than she is, and she did not invent them." Then he turned and went down to his dinner, and the dowager's face had gone the color of ash, and Lady Cassandra had gone very still. And Eleanor walked out the front door of Harrogate House into the autumn dark with her box of pins, and she did not weep until she was halfway down the hill. She wept not because of the cruelty. She had been handling cruelty for 3 years, cruelty she could fold and pin and set aside. She wept because the Duke had defended her, and being defended was more dangerous than being despised, because being defended let her hope, and hope was the one luxury her father's debts had taught her she could not afford. She resolved, walking down the hill in the dark, to refuse the next thing the great house sent her. She would end it. She would protect herself, the only way a woman in her station could, by removing herself, before she could be removed. She did not get the chance to remove herself, because the dowager moved first, and the dowager moved with the full machinery of her position. Within the week, a letter came to Eleanor's landlord, and the landlord who held his lease, through a steward who held his living, through the Harrogate estate, regretted that he would need the shop by the quarter day. Within the same week, Mrs. Zupper, Pellants at the linen draper's, let it be known that any woman who gave her custom to Miss Mercer would find her own custom unwelcome, and the village, which had been content to despise Eleanor from a comfortable distance, discovered the pleasure of despising her with a purpose. Her trade dried in a fortnight. The torn things stopped coming down the hill because the dowager had forbidden it, and Julian, delighted, had taken to telling the story at every table that would have him, how the family's pet seamstress had got above herself and been put down, how she had thought a duke's notice meant something, how she was, in the end, no way. A mouse who had mistaken a cat's patience for kindness. He told it once too often, and he told it in the wrong place. He told it at the inn loudly, to a table of his friends, on a night the Duke's steward happened to be settling the great house's account with the innkeeper in the next room, and the steward, who was a decent man and had liked the way the boy Thomas had begun to sleep, carried the tale up the hill. And the Duke, who had spent the fortnight in his silence, his household had learned to fear, learned that his mother had broken a woman's livelihood for the crime of being kind to his ward, and that his heir had spent that same fortnight making sport of her ruin. The dark moment came on a grey morning at the quarter day when Eleanor stood in the empty shop. She no longer held the cutting table, sold the pins, boxed her 3 years of careful, invisible work folded into a single trunk, and she did not know where she would go. The manor was gone. The trade was gone. The village had closed against her. She had a trunk and a needle and 24 years, and the cold certainty that the world had been right about her all along, that she was a problem the machinery solved, that being seen had been a trick of candlelight in a library she should never have entered. She sat on the trunk in the empty room and held, in her lap, the one thing she had carried out of her father's house that the creditors had not found, a small folded square of linen on which her mother had embroidered, in the last year of her life, a single yellow flower. The flower from the morning room, stitched in thread so fine it looked painted. She had never sold it. She would never sell it. It was the whole of what remained of the house with the yellow morning room, and she held it, and she did not weep, because she had no weeping left. The knock at the door was Thomas. He had run down the hill alone in the cold, without his footman, and his small face was streaked and fierce, and he held out to her a threaded needle, the needle from under his pillow, as though offering her the only thing he owned that mattered. And behind him, on the lane, on foot, bareheaded in the grey morning, came the Duke of Harrogate, who had followed a 6-year-old down a hill because the 6-year-old had been faster than any of them, and had known, in the wordless way, the boy knew everything, exactly where to run. The Duke stood in the doorway of the empty shop. He looked at the sold table and the single trunk, and the woman sitting on it, with a square of linen in her hands and a small flower stitched upon it. And whatever stone had ever been in his face was gone for good. "I did not know," he said. "Until 3 days ago I did not know what had been done in my name." That is not an excuse. A man is responsible for what is done in his name, whether he knows it or not. I have come to ask you not to go." "Your Grace," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady because she had decided it would be, "your mother is right about one thing. A woman ought to keep to the station God assigns her. I have tried. I cannot keep to a station in a village that will not let me earn my bread. There is nothing here for me now." "Then there will be something elsewhere," he said. "You will not decide it sitting on a trunk in a cold room. Come up to the house." It was a command. It was the old shape. Come inside, sit down, eat something. Yet his eyes were not commanding. His eyes were asking, and a man like Adrian did not know how to ask with anything but his eyes. And Eleanor, who had resolved on the hill to refuse the next thing the great house sent, found that the next thing the great house had sent was the man himself. On foot, bareheaded, with his silent ward's hand in his, and she could not refuse it. She stood. She put her mother's flower in her pocket. She took the threaded needle from Thomas's small hand and held it. And the boy made a sound, the first sound any of them had heard him make in 2 years, a small cracked syllable that was almost her name. The public reversal did not come quietly, because the dowager would not permit anything to be quiet. She had assembled the autumn's grandest dinner for the following night. 33 guests, the county's whole consequence, Lady Cassandra placed at the Duke's right hand, and the engagement she intended to announce, sitting ready on her tongue like a sweet she had been saving. The candelabra were lit the length of the table, the orchestra she had brought from London tuned in the gallery. And into that room, after the second course, before the dowager could rise to make her announcement, the Duke rose first, and the table went still, because a Duke rising is a kind of weather no one argues with. He did not look at Lady Cassandra. He did not look at his mother. He looked at the doors, at the end of the long room, and the butler opened them, and Eleanor stood there, in a gown of soft green that the Duke's own household seamstress had sat up 2 nights to make, with her mother's yellow flower pinned at her breast, and Thomas's small hand in hers. She did not know what was happening. She had been told only that the Duke wished her to come, and she had come, because she had stopped being able to refuse him. The room turned. 33 faces turned, and among them Mrs. Pellants, brought to wait upon the linens, who had called her a mouse with airs, and the curate's wife, who had read her refusal as pride, and they all looked at the seamstress in green at the head of the most consequential table in the county, and the county did not know what its own face should do. The Duke crossed the room. He crossed it in the silence the candlelight had built, past his mother, past the rival in her diamonds, past 33 held breaths, and he stopped before Eleanor and Thomas. And he took her hand, the chalk-rough hand with the small old needle scars on the fingers, and he turned to face the room that had spent a season deciding what she was. "This is the woman I intend to marry," he said. 8 words. They landed in the silence, and the silence held them. For the length of a breath, no one in that great, bright room moved at all. Then the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate made a sound that was not a word, a small broken intake, and her hand went to the table to steady herself, and the rings on it clicked against the wood. And she did not rise to make her announcement, because the announcement she had carried like a saved sweet had turned to ash on her tongue. Lady Cassandra set down her glass, with the great care of a woman who understands she has lost and will not be seen to mind. And at the foot of the table a footman, whom no one was watching, a young man who had once carried torn coats down a hill, allowed himself the smallest smile. The Duke did not gloat. He had not crossed the room to ruin his mother. He had crossed it to claim Eleanor. And the difference was the whole of his character. He turned back to the Dowager, and his voice gentled, and he said only, "You taught me that a man owes his name a great deal. You did not teach me he owes it more than he owes the truth. I have found the truth at the bottom of the hill, mending the things this house was ashamed of. I will not pretend I have not." The dowager looked at her son, and then at the green-gowned woman with the yellow flower, and then at the silent boy, who was not, the county would later swear, quite so silent as he had been. And something in the old woman's face gave way, not collapse exactly, but the slow correction of a person who has been confidently wrong for a very long time, and has just been shown the edge of it. She inclined her head. It was a quarter-inch from the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate. It was a surrender. The county, which always knew which way the weather had turned, recognized the new direction within the hour, and by the end of the evening, Mrs. Pellance had told 3 separate people that she had always said Miss Mercer was a gentlewoman, fallen on hard times and deserving of every kindness, and the curate's wife had decided that the refused invitation to tea had been a matter of the poor girl's modesty, and Lady Cassandra had remembered an engagement in London that required her early departure. The machinery that had ground Eleanor down for a season reversed its direction with the indecent ease of a thing that had never had any conviction in it at all, and Eleanor, who watched it turn, felt no triumph. She felt only tired and warm, and the strange weightlessness of a person who has set down a trunk she has been carrying a very long way. The wedding was small, by the standards of a duke, which is to say it was enormous by any other standard, and it was held at the estate chapel in the first week of December, with snow beginning outside the narrow windows. The moment that mattered was not the chapel. The moment that mattered came later in the library. 3 stories of books high on the first evening, Eleanor could truly call the great house her home. When the snow had begun to fall in earnest and the fire had been built up, and Thomas had fallen asleep on the hearthrug with a threaded needle in his small fist, the way he now slept everywhere fearless. The Duke sat in the deep chair. Eleanor sat near the fire with her mother's square of linen in her lap, the yellow flower turned up to the light, and she was teaching herself, after 3 years, that she did not have to mend anything tonight, that her hands could simply be still. Adrian watched her hands be still. "You may have the morning room," he said in the level voice that no longer frightened her, because she had learned to hear the thing underneath it. "The yellow one. It faces east. I am told there was once a pianoforte." He had asked the steward. He had found out about the house with the yellow morning room and the mother at the pianoforte, the whole of the history she had given him in a single sentence in this same room months before, and he had remembered it, and he had given it back to her as a gift wrapped in a command. Eleanor looked at him across the firelight. This stone man who had learned to ask with his eyes, and now at last with his clumsy, careful words, and she understood that she had been seen all along, from the first morning, from the absent tear in a sleeve, and that being seen was not, after all, a trick of candlelight, but the truest thing that had ever happened to her. She did not weep, though she might have. She crossed the room instead, and she knelt by his chair, and she put her mother's flower into his hand, the yellow flower stitched in thread so fine it looked painted, the whole of what remained of the house she had lost, and she let him hold it, because she had finally found someone she trusted not to let it tear. Outside the narrow windows, the snow came down over the estate, and the village and the lanes she had once wept upon. And inside the warm, bright room a fire burned, and a child slept fearless on the hearth, with a needle in his fist. And a duke held a small embroidered flower in his open palm, as though it were the most fragile and the most valuable thing in all of England, which, to the woman kneeling beside him, it was. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If it warmed you on a cold evening, tell me in a quiet word below, and I will see you at the next fire.